Mr. Riegle published 4 articles that's over a 5-year span, beginning in 1953 and finishing in 1958. So these are about 65 years old. And they fall in the category of a cipher. And this is a very...
Go on.
Pardon?
It's okay.
Okay. These fall within the category of a cipher. And the gist of Mr. Riegle's idea is that Francis Bacon, he didn't just hide some information about his personal life story or some secret signature that he wrote this or that, but this cipher contains his true philosophy that he wants to know, and that this cipher is almost invisible. Not that it's got an invisible ink that you can show by heating up or by rubbing it with ammonia or anything, but the cipher is made up of microscopic characters that are virtually invisible to the naked eye. And that through experimentation, we need to invent the tool of lenses that will enable us to clearly see these ciphers. Then we can interpret the ciphers, and then we'll be able to read Bacon's true philosophy. So that's the gist of his 4 articles. Now let me go through them just kind of quickly one by one. His first article comes out in March of 1953, which incidentally is the issue in which Alfred Dodd's obituary is printed. He apparently just died right before this thing went to print. So there's a very short obituary in there about him. And as the editors always do, they're very courteous and magnanimous in their introduction. So let me read. They say, Mr. Riegle offers a new approach to the philosophy, mainly through the medium of those ciphers so pointedly mentioned by Bacon in the De Augmentis. Mr. Riegle, as will be seen from his article, contends that Bacon actually did complete the framework of his instauration, and that the hidden and veiled contents of his writings, which is to be found chiefly in the original editions, does in fact constitute the 4th and 5th parts of the Instauration Magna, although these are usually supposed to be missing. On this question, we preserve an open mind. If the cipher claims can be demonstrated, so much the better. So the editor is saying, here's an article, keep an open mind. It would be good if this is all true. And the first article is called Francis Bacon, His Intellectual World and Primary Philosophy. So I downloaded this because I'm often interested in what other people, how they kind of consolidate Bacon's philosophy. I'm really most interested in the scientific and sort of esoteric science part of Bacon's thinking. And I think the title might have been a little bit of a misnomer, because this article is really about how we should go about finding Francis Bacon's intellectual world and his primary philosophy. And he starts with a quote from Bacon, that since the state of knowledge is not prosperous, nor greatly advancing, a different way must be opened up for humans to acquire knowledge. But we all know that's more or less the mission of Bacon's life, to advance the art of learning. And then Mr. Riegle says, I should like to present my interpretation of what this different method is. And then the next few paragraphs, as he does in the next several articles, he tells us we need to kind of clear our minds and rid it of any defects in the way that we're thinking and so forth, be open-minded. And he reminds us of Bacon's idols of the mind. And in particular, in this article, he focuses on the idol of the cave. And you all probably remember the idol of the cave are those things unique to us as individuals, maybe our inherent tendencies as a result of genetics and family and educational and experiences, life and so forth. So it is our individual opinions and viewpoints on things that tend to cloud or can cloud the way we view things. We need to be on guard against, these are not his words, but we need to be on guard against confirmational bias and theory tenacity. Always a good advice for everything. And he's telling us we need to do that in order to find Bacon's hidden intellectual world. And then he We all know also Bacon was very fond of the 25th proverb, of the effect that it's a glory of the God to create a thing and a glory of the king to seek it out. And with that in mind, Mr. Riegle determines that Bacon was going to sort of play the role of God and create his own intellectual world and hide his philosophy in it for us to seek it out, because in the process of working it out, it becomes more meaningful to you. So specifically, he writes, we discover that Bacon's plan was to create a new world patterned according to the divine creation, which is described in Genesis, and formed by means of similitudes. So similitudes is a key word. There are lots of similitudes, metaphors, maybe stretches of the imagination to go into creating this world. So Bacon's going to create a world for us and put his philosophy in it. And to support the idea that Bacon is doing this, Mr. Riegle pulls out 3 quotes from Valerius Terminus, 2 from Novum Organum, and then another quote from the Wisdom of the Ancients. So 6 snippets kind of put together into one explanation here to validate this is what Bacon's plan is. And here I want to state something. I know this is to steal man's idea and not interject our own opinions, but I think this is important to interpreting some of these articles, which, to be honest, I found them hard to understand. Just as Riegle has here used 6 quotes to support this idea that Bacon intends to create an intellectual world, he does this for most of his ideas throughout all these articles. And so roughly 1/3 to 40% of the total verbiage in these articles are quotes pulled from Bacon. And sometimes these, I've seen some of these before, so these are sometimes pulled from things that Bacon is talking about in a different context. The quotes are a little bit pulled out of context from here, from here, from here. And then when you put them all together, personally, I find Bacon hard enough to understand, somewhat abstract from time to time. And the way they've been kind of cut and pasted together here, I find much of this very difficult to interpret. So I had to read it over and over and over again. And I sometimes wonder, did Mr. Riegle get this idea from reading Bacon and say, he's trying to say he created this intellectual world for us to decipher, or did he get this idea originally and then kind of as he's reading through Bacon, he finds a sentence here and 2 sentences there with words in it that all put together sound like it supports his hypothesis. All right, having put that out there, here's how he goes about creating his intellectual world according to the divine creation. So on the first day, God created light. So light is very important because it's first. And by light, Robert Riegle means, real light. So in, sometimes when you see in interpretations of Genesis, and this is certainly the case in Mason. Is anybody else out there a Mason? We use the word light as sort of truth, knowledge, the divine plan, and so on and so forth. But Robert Riegle means light. And he says here, since light was the first thing created, it is necessary for us to make a thorough study of light. Our first step, therefore, is to make a complete study of the visible light that surrounds us and penetrates into every nook and cranny, no matter how small. And then he goes on and talks about colors, refraction, reflections, convergences, shadows, transparencies of both natural and artificial light. So light is pretty important. That's the first thing created. The second thing we need, of course, on the second and third days, God created, the waters and the land. So we need a similitude that's going to represent the waters and the land, or the materials of Bacon's world. And he tells us that the proper similitudes are paper, particularly damp paper as it comes off the press when it's manufactured, represents the seas. And the ink that goes on that paper represents the land in Bacon's intellectual world. So now we have light, paper, and ink. And the fourth thing that needs to be created are the heavens. So we need the stars, the planets, the comets, and so forth. And then to support this idea, he quotes quite a bit from Bacon about astronomy and astrology. And then Mr. Riegle writes this: since we are creating Bacon's intellectual world by means of similitudes, we must discover objects to represent the stars and planets that have the following qualifications. They must be transparent or have reflective qualities. They must produce heat and have an effect upon the materials that make up Bacon's world, that is the ink and the paper. They must have varying effects that change according to their distances and positions in relation to each other. And then he says the similitudes are lenses. So he points out that if you take a double convex magnifying glass, now, a reminder, convex is, convex is something like a magnifying glass is fatter in the middle than it is at the edges. So it's kind of like shaped at the top of my hand. Concave is when there would be a dip. And magnifying glass is convex shaped on both sides. And he points out that as you put it over paper and you move it up or move it down, the words or the letters will get bigger or smaller. They may come in focus or go out of focus. And then also as you're doing that and you look off to the side, you'll see that other words and figures seem to move around a lot, sort of mimicking the action sometimes of planets and stars. And then he also points out that if you take a magnifying glass and put it between the sun and a piece of paper, you get it just right, you can create heat. So there we have light, we have paper, representing the seas, the land is the ink, the heavenly bodies are the lenses, and then the last two things we need are the creatures of the earth and the humans. Well, we're the humans. We represent Adam and Eve, and then the creatures who it is our job to have dominion over and to learn and to study, so forth. He describes as this. So the characters, these are creatures. The creatures are characters varying in sizes. They lie hidden within the printed matter, whether it be the lines forming the margins, each individual letter, the page numbers, the engravings, the emblems, the signature, or the white paper itself. These are the creatures formed by Bacon. And then, okay, so what he's saying, there's some microscopic symbols in all of those things that we need to be able to find. These are the creatures. And he points out, when we, and through many experiments, have discovered these creatures and have properly classified them and given them names, we shall be in a better position to interpret nature as Bacon intended us to. By the use of lenses, we will pierce the veil and peer into his invisible world. And then he goes on some more about the need for, these experiments with the light, they're going to involve studying the rays from lenses, refractions, reflections, magnifications, transparencies, and the like, and the methods of superinducing them, and their gradations and modes, and know how to join them together with the printed matter to be able to find these creatures. And he concludes, and he knows this is a tremendous task that might seem impossible, but he believes that through the Francis Bacon Society, this can be promulgated. Okay, and with that, he ends his first article, to be followed up with the same idea and a little bit of clarification in the second article. And I'll get through this second, and the next article is a bit quicker. The second article comes out 2.5 years later, in December of 1955. And it's called Preparations for the New Philosophy. And so in other words, what do we have to do to prepare to be able to discover this new philosophy? And it starts again like the last article with a need to clear our minds. Well, he talks about the defects of our intellect and the defects of our senses, particularly our eyesight. And here he talks about the idols of the tribe. Okay, so the idols of the tribe are defects in our thinking that arise from the fact that we're human beings. We all have these. This is just natural for all human beings. And he puts 5 quotes out here from the Novum Organum related to idols of the tribe. And in essence, what he's saying is we tend not to react to things that we don't perceive. So if something doesn't strike our senses, we tend not to have any reason to think about it. And then when he's talking about the need to clear the defects from our senses, he's also kind of getting to the point that if something's so small and we don't see it, if something's so small, we're not likely to see it. And if we're not likely to see it, we're not likely to think about it. And to get to this new philosophy, we're going to have aids to our sight so that we can see these creatures. And again, we need to keep an open mind and free our intellect, so once we've seen these creatures, we can interpret them and find this hidden philosophy of Bacon's. And now he comes up with something interesting and kind of specific as to where these creatures are and what they might be. And he points out that the second time he read through Shakespeare's plays, he found it interesting that there were so many questions. And then he says, since some of these questions seemed irrelevant to the dialogue, my curiosity was aroused. So I examined the question marks after such questions. So he's looking at the individual question marks and found to my amazement that they were broken up into various parts. Many of them varied in construction, made up of different elements that appeared to be some kind of characters. And he points out that he looked at, with a 10 power magnifying glass, he looked at 50 question marks in almost all the plays. He says he looked at approximately 1,700 question marks. That's a pretty impressive effort, documenting what he's seen. And he says, I found the following characters to be quite plentiful. And then you've seen his list. There are little lines slanted from right to left, lines slanted from left to right, little short horizontal lines, perpendicular lines, half circles with openings towards the top, towards the bottom, towards the left, towards the right, and a few more things. And then he mentions he also, not just in question marks, but he sees them in the letters, in the lines, and not only in the folio, but also in Silva Silvarum. And then he says, it appears to me that these characters are the elements which make up some form of stenographic writing. To discover and interpret their true values will be an excellent project for the members of the Francis Bacon Society. It will be next to impossible for one person to complete such an undertaking. And then he foreshadows that with the permission of the editors, he's going to submit some ideas about what the proper optical instruments would be in order to be able to see these characters. And that's what makes up the next 2 articles. The next 2 articles is really one article broken into 2 pieces. But before those articles, here's something interesting. At the end of the second article, the editor puts a little note down. And it says, the note says, we would refer those who may think it incredible that Francis Bacon should have used a pointed microscopic cipher. You say we would refer you to W.R. Newman's treatise on the cipher of Roger Bacon, published in 1928. And the editor says, apparently Roger Bacon in the 13th century concealed microscopic characters in his manuscript. And then he says, but whether the printing presses of the 17th century could have used this method without betraying the secret is a debatable point. So this was interesting. Roger Bacon apparently had used microscopic ciphers. And I looked at it, I found this is what's called the Voynic Manuscript, which I've heard of before. And something else I found interesting, and I should have included it with this package of articles we sent, but I only discovered a couple of days ago. Mr. Riegle wrote a long letter to the editor after this second article, about 1 year later, in response to this little note. But and I'll get to that in a second. But this ciphers of Roger Bacon, this thing called it's called the Voynic Manuscript. Voynic is V-O-Y-N-I-C-H. It's the name of a guy that owned it at one time. And is anybody familiar with it?
I am.
You're okay. Well, you tell me if I've got this, because I did not go look it up too much, but I remember seeing it before. It's a book apparently from the 13th century that is unreadable because it seems to be in some language that nobody's ever been able to figure out. And it's interspersed with many illustrations of plants. And I think I remember that there's some illustrations of parts of human anatomy. And that this came to a guy named Voynic at one time who tried to decipher it all. And I think more recently, people have concluded that one, it probably was not actually owned by Roger Bacon. And that two, to some degree at least, it's sort of like a book of medicinal information about various plants. And it's kind of written in a kind of a shorthand stenographic type writing that pharmacists and doctors often use to write back and forth to each other. But anyhow, that's what the Voynic manuscript is. And Riegle has written this letter to the editor. It comes out, I think, in the next edition after his second article. And it starts, "Dear Sir, among my collection is a copy of The Cipher of Roger Bacon, which was purchased 4 years ago. This was my first knowledge of Dr. Newbold's discovery of microscopic writing in the Voynic manuscript." So 4 years ago would have been in 1951. So this would have been a couple of years before Mr. Riegle's first article. And it's not clear. I mean, it might be a possibility. Did he read that there were these microscopic symbols in Roger Bacon's manuscript, and then that gave him the idea to look for evidence in Bacon's manuscript? Or did he just see it as something that supported the idea that he had already come up with? But he was familiar with this manuscript. And then here's something else really interesting. At the very next sentence, he goes, "I have been in correspondence with a member of the intelligence relative to the hidden figures I had found in the original of Bacon's works." So I don't know what the intelligence is. Is this a British intelligence agency? I doubt it's the American US CIA agent. He is an American. And it seems like the way the language goes, he's written back and forth with this guy from the intelligence quite a bit. And let's see, I've been in correspondence with the intelligence that figures. And the member of intelligence, oh yeah, he tells the member of intelligence that this Roger Bacon's book sort of helped support his ideas about Francis Bacon. And so the member of intelligence, now this gets a little tricky because I'm quoting a guy who's quoting a guy who's quoting another guy. Member of intelligence tells Riegle, because apparently Mr. Riegle had said, "What I learned from this book convinced me that my theory is substantially sound." And the intelligence man then tells Mr. Riegle, "Well, if you think Roger Bacon supports your idea, you need to go read this book by Mr. Manley because he debunks that whole idea." So Mr. Riegle, turns out he does go get this book by John Manley. And Riegle concludes, yes, the Roger Bacon cipher idea is a bunch of hooey. He agrees completely that it's the code is not there. That what look to be microscopic symbols are really, he calls it wholly subjective, which is, I recall, sort of a claim that's been made against Elizabeth Gallup sometimes, and her ability to identify these different fonts might be subjective, and that 10 people try to look at the exact same thing, they come up with a number of different answers, and it's apparently the case with Roger Bacon. So Mr. Riegle is convinced there are no hidden microscopic ciphers in Roger Bacon's book, but that's because it was handwritten, and he's dead set that his theory with Francis Bacon, where these writings were printed with type, in a printing press, that he's still absolutely correct about this. And it's a long article. There's almost 2 pages long in little type. And he goes on to support his idea, and just the point being, we just have to find the right optical device in order to be able to properly see these microscopic creatures. And this then leads into his last two articles, which are now, he is searching for some clues from Bacon as to how to create this optical device. Because remember, I think embedded in all that, he's assuming that Francis Bacon actually had this thing, and that he used this thing when he created these symbols, had to use this thing to make these symbols inside the little pieces of type that went into the printing press. And I don't get the sense this is just a normal magnifying glass, because he mentioned he sees little lines and half circles and perpendicular lines and so forth, but I don't get the impression those are the proper symbols. So it's, you may have a different opinion, but I think he's thinking there's something that should twist all those symbols into the proper symbol. And I don't know if he's thinking there's something that would take all those little line segments and so forth and turn them into, you know, regular letters like an A, B, C, D, E, or will it convert them into some other kind of symbols? And if they do turn them into some other kind of symbols, how would he ever know when he found the right kind of symbol? But anyhow, he's going into the third and fourth articles, looking for clues as to what the right optical device would be. And again, not to tell us what it is, but here's my train of thinking about what they might be. And this will go kind of quickly here, but in the third article, again, he pulls a lot of quotes from Bacon, and we need to clear our minds, but he's zooming in on Bacon's history of the winds. And this is just, this whole, a little aside here, Bacon was such a polymath. I mean, he knew about everything. And this history of the winds is basically the encyclopedia he wrote about everything we know in the world about winds, types of winds, the sources and the cause of winds, the effects and the uses of winds, and on and on. And within here is a description of all the sails that are on ships. And he makes a list of 28 observations of sails on ships, with more than 20 descriptions for the specific sails on a typical 1,100-ton ship. And now Riegle is really interested in these descriptions of sails for two reasons. One, you know, when a sail is full of wind, it's got a concave side and it's got a convex side. So that's sort of a lens-like idea. And there are some very specific metrics in Bacon's description of sails. And Bacon doesn't normally get, you know, very specific on anything mathematical. But for example, just put at random number 13. The top sail was 46.5 feet deep, 69 feet wide at the base, and 18 feet at the top. And so Mr. Riegle thinks somehow these numbers and the ratio of these numbers are a clue that Bacon put there for us to be able to use towards coming up with the proper shape of the lenses that we need to be able to turn these microscopic symbols into the properly shaped creatures. And I don't follow the logic, but I think he comes to the point he needs sort of a rectangular shaped magnifying glass, convex, but instead of just kind of going up smooth curve of that glass, it needs to be kind of parabola shaped, like the old-timey S's were when they're printed. So he needs a rectangular, parabolic shaped convex lens, and he comes up with a design for it. And he mentions that he's gone to 5 manufacturers of optical devices in the US and 3 in West Germany. And they all tell him that their facilities are not set up to produce something like that. And he determined to have it handcrafted lens of that design would be prohibitively expensive. So he says he makes one himself out of plastic, but he tests it and it doesn't work. So it doesn't work. I'm not sure how he determined it. It didn't magnify properly. I think it changed the color such he wasn't happy with it, but that's not it. And so he's determined to continue his search, and his search goes on here in article number 4, printed in the next edition. This will be his last one in June 1958. And though he's still interested in everything else Bacon has written, and the winds, but now he's zooming in on what Bacon had to say about music and the physics of sound. And he writes about tones, sounds emitted from different shaped objects, harmony, concords and discords, diapasons, and how these are similar to some of the same concepts of sound with the way that light behaves in various shaped lenses. And without coming to any real conclusions, he gets down to his concluding paragraph. It appears to me that the study of music is a clue to the construction of lenses based upon concords and diapasons, etc., just as a sails in a ship, the motion in its prerogative instances, and the study of heat and cold reveal actions comparable to those found in lenses. And from all these likenesses can be derived axioms that help develop his primary philosophy. And the last sentence, so that the pipes of Pan indicate the harmony and consent of things, and the concords mixed with discords. And that ends Mr. Riegle's fourth article. And from what I know, he just kind of faded into existence. I did look through the issues that came out after this fourth article for a year or two, and I don't see that anybody ever wrote a letter to the editor about this topic, except for the one that I already mentioned that Riegel wrote himself. It doesn't look like anybody had ever commented on this. And and I don't know, did I ask in the beginning, does anybody know anything about Mr. Riegel other than the fact he was an American? He's obviously very knowledgeable about everything Bacon wrote, and he was doggedly determined to follow his idea. But does anybody know any more about him?
No.
No.
I looked him up on Google, but when I look up people on Google, I find something, and then I look again, and I can't find it the first thing. But there was something about that he had written papers that were published in the Library of Medicine in America. It didn't say what the papers were, but somewhere else it had got him as part of something like the Society or the Board of Audio Research for Hearing. And then he obviously talks about wearing of glasses. I think there was another paper on that. So he actually did put into practice, I think to have been so interested in such detail of measurement and everything else, he obviously did use those skills, and I would think he maybe did make some breakthroughs in helping people with hearing aids and spectacles, perhaps. Maybe.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I know sometimes when I go to look people up on Google,
Yeah.
you probably found on Facebook, there could be 100 people in the world named Robert Riegle. But it sounds like you found the right one.
I think so. It was the right time. I think there was a date on some of them, but there were a lot of Robert Riegles. Yes, you're right.
So before we move on to get some feedback just about building the Steelman case, is this what Robert Riegle, is this what he intended to say? Does that seem like a reasonable hypothesis, a synopsis, or did anybody see something different, or want to add, anything? I don't hear anything, so.
It's great, John, what you've done. So I learned a lot. So just to let you know, as feedback, you're in it's very interesting what you're bringing up. So.
Okay, well, thank you. I can't.
Yes, and I think the last bit about music was very interesting in connection with Rudolf Steiner's pronouncements about the chemical ether, which is the tone, sound, and number ether, where you're linking sound with number and dimensions. So I think that could be taken a lot further. Some very exciting links with the ethers I found in all these articles. For another day.
Yeah, there's just so much to know about these sorts of things, and the fact that, well, the fact that Francis Bacon himself could write about all of them, and Robert Riegle's able to kind of synthesize what he's read and try to move it forward. It's just amazing to me.
Yeah.
Now, so if we think we have sort of established what he was trying to tell us, what do people think about his ideas?
I think I'd like to just say that you felt that he pulled quotes from different sources, but it seems to me Bacon does repeat himself in different ways. So in the Silva Silvarum, there are things about music, and then you find it in some other, the Nova Morgana. So I do think that he does repeat himself, and then quotations that are used for him, like the two I gave, you find different quotations in different works, and also if they've been translated either into Latin or from Latin. So there is a sort of plethora sometimes of the same idea expressed in a different place.
Yeah.
In terms of what I felt from listening was that he's onto something, but he's missing kind of the spiritual dimension of Bacon, and why he wants, that there's a way that, especially in the training of what I feel he did by his Masonic sons and his Rosicrucian sons, and hopefully some daughters were there, but that he was really saying that he was setting up a process to help people to align with an information that comes from their higher self and higher mind. So his invisible process, I feel, has a lot more to do with that. I mean, I think there is a part that, because Bacon himself says that there's divine and then there's philosophy. But for him, the more superior was the divine. And his hiding things was to go within, so that you have to kind of get it from, and that became his method to work with his disciples of sorts. So I think Riegel may have missed some of those things, although possibly all of what he's trying to do with this lens could very much be the case. And there is something that came out in Kingdom for a Stage, Joy Hancock's work, about some scientist that was up in Canada that had actually done a lot of the research from River Labs, where Fabian had set up his labs. And he was working with an invention that Bacon had done with sound at that point. It's in that book. Joy Hancock mentions his name. He's very interesting. I don't know if he's still alive, but he might be, or maybe if you contact her. And of course, her expertise was in acoustics of the globe. And that's how she kind of initially got interested in Bacon. Not that she was even predisposed that way, but then there was too much evidence that was coming towards her. But this man wrote to her, and he's the one that said, you should look into Bacon here, and he was this one that was claiming the scientific instrument that Bacon had created. And he, because often people say, well, he didn't really create anything. He's the father supposedly of experimental science, but he didn't really do anything. And in fact, there is this invention having to do with sound. And of course, sound and light is the fundamental, at its quantum level, which is really, I think, what Bacon was trying to do, was the light. When he talks about the light, it's the ultimate, for somebody to discover the light behind nature, it's discovering the quantum pattern, if you will. Anyway, that's what I got out of things. So if that, anyway.
This takes us back to the ethers.
Yes, you had something to say, because Bacon had shares in the wireworks, did he not, at Tintern?
Yes.
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 would be very interested in the possibilities, perhaps, of using.
And John's forests, out by those wire works, we're out by the forest there, on the Wales English border. So,
I hadn't realised actually it's 5 o'clock, and I wondered whether you want a little break now, and we're going to go towards. Should we have a little bit more time here, and then?
Let me just follow with Mary Ellen's point. I wholeheartedly agree. He often talks about the divine and sort of the material. In fact, there's a really good quote. I kind of used it in my dissertation in his essay of Studies, he talks about, I think it's knowledge is like water. Some of it seepeth up from below, like this would be the knowledge we dig out with experiments, and some of it sprinkleth from above, like intuition. Some stuff just comes to us. Some of it we have to work to get. There's a balance between those two sources of knowledge, and real spiritual growth comes when you recognize that there is this divine source of knowledge, and you have got, and this could be what Riegle's referring, when you've kind of cleared your idols of the mind, of the fact, it's not everything there's things in the world that you can't see. Just doesn't mean that they don't exist just because you don't see them. And so maybe this is what he's getting at here.
And in the New Atlantis, there are many suggestions of things that they were using that we don't even have now, isn't it? Like the power to communicate through thought alone. That sort of thing, and the sounds in the caves, their experiments. So all those sorts of things are really far into the future.
I guess my personal thoughts of this is he says Bacon is hiding his philosophy. Well, I think Bacon's philosophy, his lifelong philosophy to come up with a long-term systematic approach to experimenting based on empirical evidence and inductive reasoning and collaboration amongst scientists around the community or the world, and discover all the cause and effect relationships. And that's all pretty well spelled out. I don't know what else would constitute his philosophy. And then I'm afraid I'm a little bit of a skeptic on the idea that they could take these microscopic symbols and put them in a little piece of type, given the technology, how rough paper was back then, and the ink and so forth, and think that you could reliably print these things on a paper, and then hope somebody's going to come along and recognize they're there and invent the proper tool to be able to see them correctly again. I'm just not buying that. What I wished, Riegel mentioned in his letter that he had 4 copies of the Silva Solarum. I wish somebody, where he'd seen these symbols, it would be really helpful to know, did he go to the exact same question mark on all 4 different pages? Does he see the exact same symbols in all 4 of those, all 4 of those copies that he's got? Anyhow, anybody else? That's my thoughts.
it's interesting.
Diana.
When I was reading the articles, the first thing that struck me very strongly was the term similitude and about light, which made me think immediately of Alberti on painting, which was written, I don't know if any of you know this text, written in 1435. And the first book, 3 parts, Alberti writes this treatise about how the eye works. And I think he had it wrong. I think it's very, very funny article. It's a bit Thunderbirds ago, with rays of light coming from the eye, lighting the object for the artist to paint. Are you familiar? And the expression that also struck me is because he talks of verisimilitudine, very similitude. So similitude, but an extra added very, which truth. And it's quite a strange theory that they're working out the laws of perspective. But I also thought of the shape of the eye and the cave. I read various works where I found a round symbol with a point, and I realized that I was looking at some sort of cipher. I think it was about John Dee. Anyway, the eye and the iris made me think of the veil and the piercing, the roundness of the eye, the eyelid covering the eye, the cave, and of course then the ears, the eyes and ears into the mind. So I sort of thought also the shape of the bow, the iris also meaning colour from rainbow, and the shape of a bow as in an arrow. And these were my thoughts. I don't know if any of you. Hello?
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 We're all here just listening.
Yes.
I don't know, these are my sort of strange ramblings, but it seems that this Albertian theory, I don't know if Bacon was familiar with it, but I found it a lot of parallels. I also recently read this Heaven's Breath, which is by Lyell Watson, a recent publication, A Natural History of the Wind, which was rather wonderful. The sound part, I had more trouble connecting with what he was trying to say in his articles, but the similitude part I found very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, can I just bring up to John, I'm thinking, you know, one of the things, I mean, Bacon did hide things for good reasons, politically and for, you know, reasons having to do with what he was going through as a human being. So there was great reason to do, but he also, to hide, but he also wanted people to discover it. So he did in De Augmentis, you know, give the formula for the biliteral cipher. And he felt from there it would discover, you know, the word cipher of Dr. Owen. It seems to me that with this microscopic cipher, he would have given some indications because he wants people to discover his story and what he's about. He's very much, he was saying, you know, for a future age, I leave it to a future age when people will be more ready. So I would kind of agree with you, John, that, you know, this, like, doing all kinds of things, unless he would leave the formula as to how that could be done or why. You know?
Well, I think Mr. Riegle would tell us he did leave the formula, and he tries, but I guess I just don't, I think that formula is pretty obtuse. I'm not sure that he hasn't convinced me he found it. It would be a little more obvious, and just the technology, I just don't think it's technically possible to have created little microscopic. Keep in mind, Bacon would have had to have this instrument to be able to know how to create a symbol that when looked through it would turn into another symbol. And with technology that existed 500 years ago, put that in little metal pieces of print. And with the roughness of the paper and the ink, it just, everything's going to get all blobbed together, it seems to me. But,
yeah. Plus, he used other people to set the type. I mean, I think he orchestrated things, but I mean, you see those emblems, and he had assistants. You know, they weren't trained with all that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, there'd have to be 1,700 different question marks, and the printer would have to know which one to go where.
Yeah.
Just that would be a lot of effort. That would have to be a pretty powerful secret to hide.
Well, thank you very much, John.